They called it Hollow Creek Plantation, a stretch of land so quiet it seemed immune to time itself. Even today, the air above its overgrown fields feels wrong, like sound doesn't carry the way it should. If you whisper, it dies in the air. If you shout, it feels like the ground swallows your voice. People say that back in the 1800s, no slave woman ever ran from this place. Not one. Not through swamp or cane field or the black water that curled around its border. In a world where escape was a desperate daily dream, that fact alone made Hollow Creek infamous. At first, it was spoken of with pride by the white families nearby. They'd say, "Old Whitfield runs a righteous house. His women don't run, because they're treated well." But others whispered something else, that they didn't run because they couldn't, because something in the soil beneath Hollow Creek held them still, the way roots hold bones when they've been there too long. Even now, when the wind shifts over that ground, you can hear what sounds like breath rising from below. The plantation records still exist, faded ink on brittle paper sealed in the county archive in St. Landry Parish. Between 1821 and 1859, dozens of men escaped from Hollow Creek. Some were caught, some were shot, some vanished into the marsh and were never seen again. But when you trace the columns marked female property, every single name ends in the same place. Remains. No crossouts, no notes of sale or disappearance. Just that single word, over and over again. It doesn't make sense. Statistically, historically, psychologically, it's impossible. Fear explains a lot, but fear alone doesn't stop an entire group from ever trying. The main house still stands, though it's sinking. Its white columns lean like they've been softened by rain, and the roof sags inward as if the house is tired of remembering. Locals avoid it, but once in a while a photographer or historian wanders close enough to feel that strange quiet that presses against the chest. One of them, a restoration worker named Howard Greaves, described it best. He said the silence there feels heavy, like someone's watching from under the floorboards. Back in the 1820s, Hollow Creek was known for two things: the sweetness of its cane and the strictness of its overseer. Master Elias Whitfield inherited the land from his father, a man whose methods were considered uncommonly effective. Elias was younger, educated in Charleston, known for his gentility and soft voice. He rarely raised a hand himself. He didn't have to. His eyes alone were enough to quiet a field. People said he had a strange control over his workers, not through violence, but through something harder to name. The slaves called him the Quiet Master, and to them, quiet was never a good thing. The surrounding plantations all reported the same pattern: attempts, escapes, hunts. But Hollow Creek stayed eerily still. In 1834, a man named Abel, who had escaped from a nearby estate, was captured 3 miles north of Hollow Creek. According to the sheriff's record, he refused to enter Hollow Creek's boundaries, even when he was promised food and water. "Not there," he reportedly said. "They hum down there." The phrase made no sense at the time. The sheriff thought he meant humans, but years later, linguists looking into plantation oral history realized he probably meant they as in something underground produced a sound like low voices. No one believed him, of course. Superstition was the language of survival. Yet the longer you study Hollow Creek's history, the more those superstitions line up with facts. Take the overseer's weekly reports, each one signed off by Whitfield himself. Everything is routine until late 1839. After that, every report includes an additional line written in different ink: "Transfer complete." At first, historians assumed these meant slave sales, but no sale records exist, not a single one. No money exchanged hands. No names were reassigned to other owners. Just "transfer complete." People tried to explain the obedience. Some said the women were better fed, less punished, more protected. But even the plantation's own ledger disputes that. Punishments were listed openly: whippings, confinement, deprivation, all in meticulous handwriting. One entry from 1842 describes a woman named Adeline being whipped for praying after curfew. The punishment was recorded, the injury treated, and the next week she returned to work. The column marked "disposition" reads simply, "remains." The word shows up again and again, in the same hand, in the same place, like an echo written into the page. By the 1850s, other plantation owners began to resent Hollow Creek's reputation. They sent men to observe Whitfield's methods, expecting to find some secret of discipline. What they found instead disturbed them. Workers moved with mechanical precision. When spoken to, they answered slowly, as if their thoughts had to travel from somewhere far away. One visitor wrote that their eyes did not follow motion. Another, an overseer named Thomas Brigg, noted in his journal that the women hum in the fields when they think they are alone, low, deep, like wind in a hollow place. When war came and the Confederacy began to crumble, many plantations erupted into chaos. Slaves fled, joined Union forces, or disappeared into the swamps. But Hollow Creek burned quietly. Whitfield was killed, some said by Union soldiers, others whispered his own slaves turned on him. When troops finally reached the property, they found no one, no men, no women, only empty quarters and a house locked from the inside. A lieutenant named Samuel Dre recorded that the doors to the cellar were sealed with iron nails, as though someone was trying to keep something in, not out. After emancipation, Hollow Creek was sold off and abandoned. No descendants of its enslaved women were ever traced. No one claimed lineage from that soil. Genealogists find the records stop cold. It's as if every bloodline that began there ended there too. And yet, in interviews from neighboring plantations, you'll hear the same phrase whispered even decades later. Don't dig too deep by Hollow Creek. By the early 20th century, the place had fallen into ruin, its name nearly forgotten except by local children daring each other to approach the gate. One of those children, now an old man, once said that when he was small, he pressed his ear against the ground near the old house and heard what sounded like voices rising from under the wine earth. Not screams, he said softly. Not words either, just something that wanted to be remembered. The strange thing about Hollow Creek is how little remains in physical record, yet how persistent the story is. The ledgers, the whispers, the silences between them. All of it points to something deliberate, something orchestrated. This wasn't just fear keeping those women in place. It wasn't kindness, and it wasn't chains. It was something deeper, something that reached beyond the body. And that's where the story truly begins to turn. Because when the first reconstruction team arrived decades later and uncovered a portion of the earth that had caved near the main house, what they found suggested that the phrase "transfer complete" might not have been a metaphor at all. It might have been the beginning of something far darker, something buried, waiting to breathe again. The ledger was discovered by accident in the summer of 1932, tucked inside a false wall behind the remnants of a wine cabinet. The house had already begun to rot from the inside out. The wood was swollen with moisture, the walls soft enough that a hammer tap could crumble them. A man named William H. Carr was the one who found it. He was a local historian with an obsession for cataloging forgotten estates, and Hollow Creek was his prize. The ledger itself was wrapped in a sheet of oilcloth, blackened by mold, but when Carr opened it, the ink was still legible. The handwriting was careful, disciplined, the kind of script taught in old academies. Every page bore dates, names, and numbers written with a precision that bordered on obsession. The first entries looked ordinary, lists of supplies, labor tallies, harvest weights. But then came a section marked "Operations Below." That phrase alone would later unsettle the researchers who studied it. Below what? Below ground? Below stairs? Each line beneath that heading described something called a transfer. There were hundreds of them. At first glance, it seemed like simple bookkeeping. Transfer completed, 2 female, verified by overseer. Transfer pending, 3. Transfer delayed due to illness. The problem was that no other plantation record in the region used the word that way. Transfers usually meant the sale or relocation of enslaved people, but these entries had no destinations, no buyers, no corresponding receipts. It was as if the women were being moved to a place that didn't exist on paper. Carr took photographs of the ledger before it was lost again. Some say stolen, others claim it disintegrated. The photographs show more than words. There are strange symbols in the margins, spirals, triangles, crescent shapes, drawn not with the same ink, but with what appears to be soot mixed with blood. Forensic analysis in the 1970s found traces of iron oxide, animal serum, and something resembling candle soot. None of that belonged in a plantation ledger, and yet there it was, neatly bound among columns of numbers. In the top corner of several pages, Carr noted a recurring mark, a small circle with 3 dots inside. He believed it was an initial, perhaps from the overseer. Later, handwriting analysts compared the script to other plantation records and confirmed something disturbing. The signature didn't match Whitfield's handwriting or that of his known staff. Whoever wrote operations below was someone else entirely. Someone who had access to the house but was not part of its official administration. What unsettled researchers most were the details about time. The transfers didn't follow a normal schedule. They happened in clusters, weeks with none, then sudden bursts of activity, often coinciding with lunar cycles. Each spike occurred within 3 days of a new moon. Carr circled the dates in red pencil and wrote in the margins, "Ritual cadence?" His notes suggest he believed these events weren't about work or movement at all, but about ceremony. Beneath the word transfer, certain names were underlined. Every underlined name belonged to a woman: Adeline, Ruth, Essie, Lila, each with a small symbol next to it, and beside each name, the same word repeated: confirmed. The handwriting of that word was different again, a jagged script as though written by a trembling hand. Carr theorized it might have been a witness, mark, a form of verification, but no plantation in the historical record used confirmation to verify punishment or labor. The only other context where that term appeared in the antebellum South was in certain spiritual sects, ritual confirmations of sacrifice or initiation. Carr wasn't the first to notice something was off about Hollow Creek's paperwork. In Nizar, 1909, an archivist for the parish census had already flagged the estate's ledgers as inconsistent, but his report was buried. The official explanation was that the documents were water-damaged beyond use. Yet the dates line up precisely with the years when Hollow Creek's female population began disappearing from state registries. Some of the ledger entries describe maintenance of airways. Carr thought this meant ventilation for underground storage or perhaps storm cellars, but the phrasing is chilling in hindsight. Airways maintained to ensure continuation, seals repaired after breach, breathing resumed. These aren't the words of someone managing supplies. They read like someone monitoring life itself, or something pretending to be alive. There are small stains on the pages, dark, round and uneven, like drops of wax. Carr assumed they were candle drips. Later analysis found traces of tallow mixed with something else, resin or tar. A few stains contained minute fibers of cloth, suggesting the candles were poured through fabric or gauze. Some historians speculate this was part of a ritual sealing process, the kind used in old West African burial rites where fire and earth were bound together to trap the spirit within the soil. What made the ledger truly terrifying wasn't just what it contained, but what it left out. The plantation maintained detailed inventories of tools, animals, even seeds, but there's no record of graves. Not one. Every plantation of that era had burial plots for enslaved laborers. Hollow Creek had none. The absence is louder than any record could be. Carr became obsessed. He visited the plantation more than 30 times over the next decade. His wife later told a reporter he began hearing things at night. Soft knocks under the floorboards, like someone rapping from beneath. He wrote in his journal that he dreamed of breathing earth and that the ground seemed to inhale. His notes grew erratic. On one torn page he scribbled, "Transfer complete does not mean death." When he died in 1941, his personal archive was confiscated by local authorities after a fire destroyed his study. Only fragments survived: the photographs of the ledger, a handful of letters to the State Historical Society, and a single audio recording he made on wax cylinder. The recording is nearly unlistenable. Static, hiss, faint murmurs. But around the 2-minute mark, you can hear him whisper, "It's not a book. It's a map." In the years that followed, researchers tried to match the ledger's descriptions to physical areas of the plantation. One phrase in particular, Sector B, East Airway, sealed with lime, corresponded to the eastern edge of the main house. Ground-penetrating radar done in 1974 detected hollow spaces under that area, though the state refused excavation, citing instability. Later teams confirmed the voids were roughly rectangular, about 8 feet high and lined with stone. It's easy to dismiss these findings as coincidence, but then you read the last legible page of the ledger, photographed before it vanished. It bears a single line in ink so dark it bled through the paper. All accounted for. Below remained secure. Beneath it, smeared across the page, was a palm print, faint, long-fingered, and too small to belong to an adult man. There is something uniquely unnerving about evidence that seems to know you're reading it. Carr wrote in one of his final letters that he could feel the pages watching. He described how, when light hit the paper at certain angles, faint impressions appeared beneath the visible ink, as if someone had written, erased, and rewritten the same words hundreds of times. He said the indentation pattern repeated the same 2 words across dozens of pages, still here. Forensic imaging decades later found those indentations were real. Microscopic grooves matching that phrase appear between official lines of text, invisible unless illuminated from the side. The handwriting belongs to at least 3 different individuals. No one knows who they were. Some speculate they were the women themselves, forced to transcribe their own disappearance. Others believe it was Whitfield's wife, who kept her own private notes until her journal ended abruptly in 1847. Whatever the case, the ledger's existence transforms Hollow Creek from a local ghost story into something much darker, a record of systematic erasure written in 2 voices, one documenting the surface of life and one whispering from beneath it. Every number, every line item, every ink blot becomes part of a code meant not to be understood, but to be endured. The deeper you read, the less it feels like history and the more it feels like something still unfolding. The first time anyone mentioned the voices beneath Hollow Creek, it sounded like nonsense, plantation folklore twisted through generations of fear. But even myths begin somewhere, and in this case it began with sound. Accounts from nearby estates, preserved through oral testimony and faded letters, tell of nights when the air itself seemed to hum. The noise would rise slowly after sunset, travel through the cane fields and settle like fog. It wasn't wind, it wasn't insects. It was deeper, steadier, a vibration that carried words too soft to understand. In 1842, a field hand from the neighboring barren plantation named Thomas recorded in a rare written note that the ground at Hollow Creek sings when the moon hides. He was illiterate, but he had dictated the words to a preacher who wrote them down exactly as spoken. The note was stored in the church ledger for decades, and when historians found it, they dismissed it as superstition. But several other accounts, written by soldiers, overseers, and travelers, use nearly identical phrasing. The earth hums. They're singing underground. The sound is like breath. There were no mines or caverns under Hollow Creek, no geological explanation for such a phenomenon. The plantation stood on firm loam, not hollow limestone. Yet, the testimonies persisted. The earliest description from the Whitfield family itself came from Clara Whitfield, Elias's wife, in a letter to her sister in 1839. It comes from beneath the house at night. The floorboards tremble ever. So slightly and I cannot sleep. Elias says it's the pipes settling, though we have none. The letter is still kept in the St. Landry Parish Historical Collection. Her handwriting delicate but nervous, the ink smudged at the edges. Even the enslaved workers, when questioned by visitors, avoided talking about it directly. They called it the breathing. One former slave from a nearby plantation told a researcher in 1937 during the WPA interviews that everyone in the region knew about the breathing ground. When Hollow Creek sleep, she said, the dirt breathed back. She refused to say more. Sound has always been the most deceptive of witnesses. It carries memory in ways vision cannot. The night air at Hollow Creek was thick with moisture, from the nearby bayou, which made even the faintest noise carry long and low. Locals who camped near the property decades later said they could hear what sounded like shovels striking earth. Slow, measured, like someone working without urgency, but without pause. The rhythm never changed, never grew faster or weaker. Just steady, like a pulse. One report from 1865, written by a Union private stationed near the area, describes his patrol hearing women's voices drifting through the ground like smoke. He assumed it was a trick of fatigue or swamp acoustics, yet 2 of his men heard it too. The following morning, they found their horses refused to cross the property line. The animals panicked without clear cause, ears pinned, nostrils flaring, hooves scraping backward. The lieutenant ordered them off the site. That entry, preserved in the soldier's field diary, is the last mention of Hollow Creek in any military log. Decades later, when a storm in 1912 split the ground near the western edge of the old estate, a group of children claimed they heard something breathing from the fissure before it sealed again with mud. They ran home screaming, and though their parents laughed it off, one of the men who went to investigate told the sheriff that the air inside the crack was warm, unnaturally so, like exhaled breath. The sheriff's official note simply reads, "Ground gases, no danger." But people in town said his hair went white within a year. Theories sprouted over time. Some thought it was a buried chamber collapsing in intervals, air pockets releasing from the decaying soil. Others believed it was water pressure from the bayou forcing sound through underground tunnels. But if that were true, it should have stopped after heavy rainfall. It never did. The sound returned on dry nights too, especially when the moon was new, the same timing marked in the overseer's ledger. There's an uneasiness in describing sound that doesn't belong. People say the hum was almost human, but not quite. Too low, too wide, as if coming from many throats at once. One local folklorist compared recordings made in the 1970s to a chorus of distant singing slowed down tenfold. The result was unsettling, tones that rose and fell irregularly, with pauses that seemed deliberate. When the audio was analyzed spectrographically, faint harmonic patterns appeared, not random noise but structure, almost like language. The plantation itself seemed to respond to these vibrations. Visitors who entered the cellar reported feeling air currents even when there were no openings. The candles burned unevenly, tilting toward the floor. One researcher described a faint whispering that stopped the instant he spoke aloud. He left the next morning and never returned. There's an entry in the Whitfield family correspondence that may connect these events. Elias wrote to his cousin in 1841, "The tunnels are restless again. We've reinforced the lower passage." The singing has lessened. It's the only time he ever refers to tunnels. No architectural plans of the estate show any substructure beneath the main house. The foundations, when surveyed later, revealed no cellars deep enough to merit that term. So what was he referring to? If the singing truly came from underground, it must have been produced by something, or someone, beneath the surface. Yet, no official burial site was recorded, and no excavation has ever been permitted. The ground, when probed, produces faint echoes. When metal rods are driven down, they meet resistance, then suddenly sink deeper as if piercing through empty space. The readings are inconsistent, like something below shifts or breathes. The oral histories that survive from freedmen in nearby parishes add another layer. A woman named Charity, interviewed in 1938 at age 93, said her grandmother once worked at the Creek place for 2 years before disappearing. Charity recalled her grandmother saying, "They keep the quiet ones below so they can't call the others home." The interviewer assumed it was a metaphor for punishment, but later analysis of her dialect suggests she might have been describing an actual location. Below, meaning beneath the house. The few who dared to spend nights there spoke of odd sensations, pressure in the ears, rhythmic thudding through the ground, voices that seemed to move beneath the feet. One visitor in the 1950s claimed he heard humming that followed him from room to room. He said it stopped only when he stepped outside and touched the earth beyond the gate. His report was dismissed as hysteria until 1978, when a seismologist conducting unrelated tests detected faint low-frequency vibrations under the property that did not correspond to any geological source. The readings were rhythmic, repeating every 37 seconds. That number, 37, appears nowhere in Hollow Creek's history except in the ledger. Entry 37B refers to a transfer completed after 37 days containment. Carr, the historian who discovered the ledger, once noted that coincidence in his field notes but offered no interpretation. The alignment between number and vibration is almost impossible to ignore. The pattern of sound, when played back through modern equipment, is hypnotic. It rises in waves, each crest lasting exactly the same length of time, each interval separated by silence dense enough to feel like pressure on the skull. Experts have tried to replicate it using wind through tunnels, water pumps, even animals, but none produce the same steady rhythm. Some researchers suggested it was infrasound, a frequency too low for human ears, capable of inducing fear and nausea. Yet those who've stood near the property describe the sensation not as fear, but recognition, like remembering a song without knowing where you've heard it before. No one can explain why the hum intensifies during rainfall. The ground absorbs water, muffling sound, yet Hollow Creek becomes louder. Visitors describe the rain seeming to fall slower, each drop stretching in the air. Lightning doesn't strike there often, but when it does, the echoes continue long, after the thunder fades. A surveyor once remarked that the storm did not end so much as it was swallowed. The most unsettling detail comes from recordings made by a radio technician in 1981. He placed a microphone directly into the soil and captured nearly an hour of audio. At first, just static. Then the hum begins, low, layered, breathing. But around the 43-minute mark, the frequency shifts, forming what sounds unmistakably like a human sigh. The technician quit the project afterward. When asked why, he said, "It sounded relieved." Every sound ever captured at Hollow Creek seems to tell the same story in different tongues. Something beneath that soil remembers being silenced, and every once in a while, it tries to speak again. The morning after the storm was deceptively quiet. The air hung thick with humidity, the kind that pressed against the chest and made every breath feel heavier. The fields beyond the plantation house were slick with mud, the remnants of the night's rain pooling in low spots where crops once stood tall. Inside the main house, the air was heavier still, not from the weather, but from what had been discovered the night before. No one dared speak of it openly. The master's son, Samuel, had been found in the slave quarters, not as an overseer or an intruder, but as something far more damning, a willing participant in what his father would later call a sin against blood and order. The whispers began before dawn, spreading like infection through the house servants and into the fields by midday. But no one knew what the master would do. They only knew he would not let shame go unanswered. When the master finally emerged from his study, his face was carved in stone. His silence spoke louder than rage. He called for Samuel to be brought to him, and for the 3 women, Ada, Ruth, and Lila, to be bound and taken to the barn. The command echoed across the yard, and those who heard it felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The barn had long been a place of punishment, where disobedience was broken under the weight of example. No one ever left it the same. As the sun climbed higher, the slaves moved about their duties with forced calm, pretending not to notice the men dragging the women across the yard. Ada, the eldest of the 3, walked without resistance. She had seen enough of life to know that fighting would only make it worse. Lila wept quietly, clutching the torn fabric of her dress, while Ruth's face was blank, as if her mind had retreated somewhere far away. Samuel followed behind them, unbound but pale, as though every step drained him of strength. He wanted to speak, to beg his father for mercy, but every word that rose in his throat died before it reached his lips. The stares of the onlookers burned through him. He could hear the whispers, the master's shame, the white boy who forgot his place, the women who'll pay for his sin. It was then he realized that his guilt would not save them. His silence had already condemned them. Inside the barn, dust swirled in shafts of light that pierced through the wooden slats. The air smelled of hay and sweat, and the sound of chains. Clinking filled the silence. The master stood before them, his voice measured and low. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. But it was not a question that required an answer. He wasn't speaking to his son. His gaze was fixed on the women. "You've defiled this place," he said. "You've brought corruption into this house." His tone was calm, but his eyes were wild, the kind of fury that hides behind restraint. Samuel stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Father, it was me. Don't hurt them, please." But his father didn't look at him. He only raised his hand slightly, and the two overseers at the back moved forward. The sound of a whip being uncoiled filled the room like a hiss of a serpent. Lila flinched, Ruth closed her eyes, and Ada stood tall. She turned her face toward Samuel, her voice steady. "Don't watch," she whispered. It was the last act of kindness she could offer him. But Samuel couldn't look away. When the whip cracked, he felt it as though it had struck him. Every lash was a sentence, not against their flesh but against his soul. He wanted to stop it, to throw himself between them and his father's wrath, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped between two worlds, the blood that bound him and the conscience that betrayed it. The punishment dragged on until even the overseers hesitated. Blood stained the straw. The women slumped forward, breathing shallowly, yet silent. The master turned at last to his son. "You will remember this day," he said. "You will remember what happens when lines are crossed." He gestured toward the barn door. "Now finish what you started. Send them back to where they belong." Samuel stared at him, uncomprehending. "You want me to—" His words faltered. His father's eyes narrowed. "If you lie with them as equals, you can punish them as one of them." The cruelty of the demand struck harder than any whip. Samuel dropped to his knees. "I can't," he whispered. "Then you'll answer for it," his father replied coldly. The overseers seized Samuel, forcing him upright. For a moment, it seemed the master might order his own son's death. But instead, he did something worse. He banished him from the house, disowned and disgraced. "You are no son of mine," he said. "Go and live among them, if that's what you desire." And with that, Samuel was cast out, thrown into the quarters he once visited in secret. That night, as the moon rose, the plantation was eerily silent. The barn stood empty, the floor still marked by what had happened there. The women lay in the infirmary, tended to by trembling hands. Samuel sat outside the quarters, staring into the dark. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the rustle of wind, seemed to carry his father's voice. He thought of Ada's words, "Don't watch," and realized too late what she meant. The real punishment was not what his father had done. It was what he had allowed to happen. Somewhere beyond the fields, thunder rumbled again. The air shifted, heavy with the scent of another storm. Samuel rose slowly, his clothes damp with sweat and tears. In the distance he could see the faint glow of the main house, proud and unyielding against the night. But he knew he could never go back. What had happened in that barn would never leave him. It would live on in whispers, in scars, in the way the servants lowered their eyes when he passed. It was no longer just his father's shame. It was his legacy. And as the wind swept through the empty fields, carrying the smell of wet earth and blood, Samuel understood something his father never would, that love, once condemned, does not die quietly. It hides, it festers, and one day it returns to claim its reckoning. The morning after Samuel's banishment arrived without birdsong. The plantation seemed frozen in uneasy silence, as if the land itself recoiled from what had taken place in the barn. The overseers moved about stiffly, their eyes averted from the main house, where the master remained locked in his study, drinking before noon. The servants spoke in whispers, careful not to be overheard. Every sound, the creak of wood, the distant lowing of cattle, carried a tension that refused to ease. But down by the quarters, life could not stop, even in grief. Ada lay motionless on a cot, her back a map of bruises. Lila wept quietly beside her, while Ruth, though barely conscious, muttered under her breath, fragments of prayer, or maybe curses. Samuel sat alone outside, stripped of his fine clothes, wearing the same rough linen as the men who once bowed their heads when he passed. The night's rain had left the earth soft beneath him. His hands were still stained with blood. Not his own, not entirely theirs, but of the same guilt. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, cold, unfeeling, a mask of order hiding a heart of cruelty. He had always thought his father's power was strength. Now he knew it was fear. The master feared anything he couldn't. Control, and Samuel's sin had been the ultimate rebellion, to see humanity where his father saw property. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." It was Ada. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp even through pain. She struggled to sit up, her wounds still fresh. Samuel rushed to help her, but she flinched away. "Don't," she said. "You've done enough." The words struck him harder than his father's hand ever had. "I tried to stop him," he whispered, but Ada shook her head. "You tried too late." She turned away, staring out toward the fields. "They think they can own everything here. The land, the people, even what's inside our hearts. But that's the one thing they can't keep forever." Her voice was quiet, but there was a defiance beneath it, something Samuel had never noticed before. It frightened and fascinated him all at once. As the day wore on, the plantation returned to its grim routine. The men went to the fields, the women to the wash-house, and the overseers kept watch with whips in hand. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The fear that usually kept everyone silent had turned into something else. A kind of quiet rage, a shared wound that connected them all. The story of what happened in the barn had spread to every corner of the plantation. Some spoke of vengeance, others spoke of escape, and at the center of it all was Samuel, the fallen heir who no longer belonged to either world. By dusk, Ada called for him again. She was sitting by the fire outside the quarters, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The flames cast her face in flickering gold. "Do you know why he hates you?" she asked suddenly. Samuel hesitated. "Because I shamed him," he said. She smiled faintly. "No, because you remind him of what he buried a long time ago." Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" Ada leaned closer. "Your father wasn't born this way. No man is. There was a time when he might have loved something, or someone, that made him the way he is now. Maybe he saw himself in you, and it scared him." Her words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Samuel wanted to ask more, but she only stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. That night, thunder rolled in again. The wind howled through the fields, bending the stalks like they were bowing to something unseen. Samuel couldn't sleep. He wandered through the shadows, drawn back toward the barn. The place where everything had ended, or begun. Inside, the smell of hay mixed with the faint scent of blood. He ran his fingers across the splintered wood where the women had been bound, his heart heavy with shame. But as he turned to leave, he saw something carved faintly into the beam near the door. Letters, almost invisible in the dim light. He traced them with his fingertips. R.W. Ruth's initials. Beneath them, a single word. Remember. He froze. The message was clear. They hadn't carved it in fear. They had carved it in defiance. A mark left for anyone who would find it, a reminder that what happened here would not be forgotten. Samuel felt a strange sense of resolve rise in his chest. He couldn't undo what had been done, but maybe he could make sure it meant something. He turned toward the quarters, his mind racing with a plan he didn't yet understand. Over the next few days, Samuel began working in the fields alongside the others. At first they avoided him, the white man who'd been cast out, but gradually suspicion gave way to curiosity. He worked hard, said little, and took no orders from the overseers. When one tried to strike him, he didn't fight back, but neither did he cower. The others saw this, and whispers began again, this time not of shame, but of change. Some said he was mad. Others said he had seen something in that barn that turned him against his own blood. Ada watched him quietly from a distance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she approached him. "You really mean to stay here?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "I have nowhere else." She studied him for a moment, then said, "Then you'll learn. But not from us. Not yet. You still carry his shadow." Samuel looked at her, confused. "His shadow?" She nodded. "You can't fight a man like your father until you understand the thing that made him powerful. And power," she said, softly, "isn't about the whip. It's about the silence that follows it." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. That night, as the moon rose over the fields, Samuel finally understood. His father's real weapon had never been the whip or the chains. It was the fear that kept people quiet, the shame that made them believe they deserved it. That was the thing he had to break. And so, in the weeks that followed, Samuel began to speak, quietly at first, then more boldly. He talked of freedom, of escape, of a life beyond the fields. He taught them what he knew of maps, of directions, of the stars. The plantation began to change again, not on the surface, but beneath it. Eyes that once looked down now met in silent agreement. Tools were hidden, food was stored away. Something was building, something the master couldn't see. Samuel had started it without meaning to, born out of guilt. But now it was becoming something else, a reckoning, a quiet storm that would one day break the silence his father had built his power upon. When the first shovel struck the soil that spring morning, the men digging near the old house said the ground breathed. It exhaled a deep, musty scent, wet clay and iron, like something that had been sealed away for too long. The workers were there to rebuild a collapsed cellar wall, but the deeper they dug, the stranger the earth became. It was warmer than the air above, and thin mist rose from the holes they opened. The foreman told them to ignore it, but every man there noticed the same thing. The soil was pulsing, like something alive beneath it. By noon, one of the laborers hit stone, not the kind used in plantation foundations, but smooth, circular, and arranged too deliberately. When they cleared more, they realized it was an entrance, a ring of dark rock spiraling inward, half collapsed, but still holding form. Someone long ago had sealed it with packed earth and timber. The foreman hesitated, staring at the strange design. "Probably a storm drain," he muttered, though the shape was unlike any architecture of the period. But curiosity, greed, or both made him tell them to keep going. The deeper they dug, the heavier the air became. Flies appeared out of nowhere, thick around their faces, though nothing fresh had died nearby. One of the younger men, Thomas Reed, found a length of rusted chain protruding from the soil. He tugged gently, and more of it came free, still linked, still wet, as though it had just been pulled from water. He dropped it and backed away. The others laughed uneasily, but no one wanted to touch it again. As they worked, the wind shifted. The house creaked on its foundations. A faint humming sound, so low it was almost a vibration, drifted up from the hole. Some thought it was just air pressure. Others swore it was a voice. The sound came and went, but always just beneath hearing, like a note from an unseen instrument. When one of the men spat into the hole, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Then came a hiss, sharp and quick, and the man who had spat stumbled backward, clutching his face. Something. "Burn me," he cried. His cheek blistered before their eyes. They fled to the foreman's wagon, refusing to dig another inch. The sheriff was called, then the parish pastor, then a team of builders sent to finish the job by sealing whatever had been opened. But the next morning, when they returned, the hole had changed. It was wider, the earth around it darker, almost black as if scorched. The timbers they'd left stacked neatly nearby were scattered, and from within the pit came the smell, sweet at first, then rancid, like flowers rotting in summer heat. Sheriff Dalton, a man of simple belief, stood at the edge and lit a match to see better. The flame bent sideways, drawn toward the darkness. "Wind tunnel," he muttered, though he didn't sound sure. Then, deciding this was no place for superstition, he ordered the men to board it up. They hammered the boards in a hurry, and the sound of each nail striking wood echoed like gunfire. When it was done, Dalton took off his hat and muttered a short prayer. He would later say he didn't know why. That night, the air changed again. Every animal on the plantation grew restless. The horses kicked their stalls. Chickens refused to roost and scattered into the woods. The dogs whined and clawed at the doors, desperate to be let inside. Then, just after midnight, the house itself began to tremble. The sound of air rushing through unseen cracks filled the halls. The windows, fogged with condensation though no rain had fallen. The cook, old Miss Hattie, was the first to say it aloud. "It's the breath," she whispered. "The ground's breathing again." For 3 days the plantation couldn't rest. The soil seemed to move, soft, almost fluid. Footprints filled with water seconds after being made. The pond behind. The quarters turned red, though no one could say how. The foreman, now pale and jittery, swore he saw bubbles rising from its surface, each one bursting with a faint hiss. Dalton wrote it all down in his log, trying to give order to the impossible. Soil exhales, air sour, livestock uneasy. Locals afraid to pass the road. On the 4th day, a carpenter sent to reinforce the seal disappeared. His tools were found neatly arranged by the hole, his footprints leading to the edge, none leading away. No one searched long. By sunset, the sheriff ordered the entrance buried again, deeper than before. Wagons of earth were hauled in, tamped down until the site looked undisturbed. They left a wooden cross to mark the spot, and no one spoke of it again. But silence doesn't erase what the ground remembers. Years later, when the estate passed into new hands, archaeologists arrived to document the property's history. They were told nothing of the breathing ground, just that a collapsed section of cellar might contain interesting artifacts. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Martha Leving, was meticulous, skeptical of plantation legends. She began her dig in the spring of 1973, using careful gridding and controlled excavation. The first thing she noticed was how the soil layers seemed wrong, mixed, churned, compressed in strange ways. Not natural settling, more like something had tried to force its way upward. 2 weeks in, she uncovered bone fragments, smooth, ivory white, polished like river stone. Too smooth to be human, too large to belong to any known animal. She sent samples for testing, but the results returned inconclusive. The material composition was mostly calcium and iron, but the structure didn't match bone. It was as though the fragments had been fused with clay itself. She found dozens of them arranged in a circle just below the depth where the old entrance had once been. Her notes grew more erratic after that. The dig team reported unease, sudden nausea, dizzy spells. Equipment malfunctioned, cameras fogged, lights dimmed without cause. One night, a graduate assistant quit on the spot after hearing singing beneath the soil. The next morning, Leving wrote in her field log, "They sing in air that should be silent. The pitch shifts when we walk over certain spots." She never submitted those notes for publication. When the site was finally abandoned, the parish council ordered it filled in once again, citing safety concerns. Leving left Louisiana the following year, her reputation quietly fading. In interviews decades later, she refused to discuss Hollow Creek directly. The most she ever said was in a letter to a colleague, "If the dead are not at peace, it is because something kept them tethered." What we found was not burial, it was containment. By then, the plantation had long since turned to ruin. The main house collapsed in the 1980s, and the land reverted to swamp. But those who live nearby still talk of it, how the ground steams after heavy rain, how the air smells faintly of wax and rust. Hunters avoid it. Even the birds pass over in silence. The sheriff's original log, preserved in a local archive, remains stained by some reddish residue along its edges. Scientists claim it's iron oxide. Locals whisper it's the pond. No one digs there anymore. Not since the last time the earth exhaled and refused to stop for 3 whole. The discovery came quietly, as most truths do, not with screams or thunder, but with a slow, cold realization that history had been whispering the same warning for 2 centuries. When the Louisiana State Historical Society approved a new survey of the Hollow Creek property in 2022, it was meant to be routine. The plantation had been swallowed by swamp and legend, its boundaries lost to time. The land was slated for redevelopment, and local preservationists wanted to ensure that no graves were disturbed. But when the radar screens flickered to life, that morning, everyone in the tent went silent. At first, the readings made no sense. The image showed a perfect circle, 30 feet underground. Symmetrical, deliberate, too precise to be natural. Within the circle, faint patterns appeared like spokes radiating from a center point. A cistern, maybe, one technician guessed. Another shook his head. Not that deep, and not that shape. They reran the scan 3 times, each pass confirming the same impossible geometry. Beneath the earth of Hollow Creek was something designed, something built. By noon, the lead researcher, Dr. Evelyn Cross, requested a full data export. When the software finished rendering the 3D image, she froze. The structure's shape was unmistakable. A labyrinth of narrow tunnels leading to a central chamber, encased in a ring of hardened clay. Around the outer edge, the radar reflected dense mineral deposits arranged in patterns, not random scatter. The design was identical to the West African Diamala, a ceremonial prison used to contain the restless dead. The odds of it appearing naturally were 0. That night, Dr. Cross sat in her hotel room surrounded by books, old survey maps, and photocopies of plantation records. The Diamala wasn't just symbolic. According to ethnographic records, it was a ritual circle used in parts of Guinea and Sierra Leone to bind the spirit of a person who had died violently, to prevent their soul from wandering or exacting revenge. It required chants, iron, and burial beneath clay so dense it could not be easily disturbed. The enslaved women brought to Hollow Creek were from that very region. Her pulse quickened as she realized what this meant. They hadn't just been laborers. They had been part of something much darker, a ritual of containment. The next morning, she returned to the site and compared the GPS overlay with 19th century maps. The circular structure lay directly beneath the main house, precisely under where the master's study once stood. And right above that chamber, in the foundation plans, a single note appeared in faint ink. Stone floor reinforced. Do not breach. She zoomed in on the handwriting. It matched the overseer's ledger from 1833, the same one that mentioned underground transfers. Cross's assistant leaned over her shoulder. What were they transferring? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, not people, souls. That afternoon, she visited the local archive. The records were sparse, but she found a series of letters between the plantation's owner, Whitfield, and a priest in New Orleans, dated 1847. The same year his wife's diary abruptly ended. The priest's replies were careful, coded, but one sentence stood out. Your request is unnatural. The church cannot sanctify the binding of the living to protect the dead. There was no follow-up letter, but 3 months later, the plantation's crop yield tripled, and Whitfield purchased another 50 acres of land. The implications clawed at her mind. The plantation's eerie history, no female escapes, no uprisings, perfect obedience, suddenly made sense. The women hadn't fled because something beneath the ground held them there. Whether through fear, curse, or faith twisted into horror, their spirits were bound to the very soil they worked. The Diamala wasn't a myth. It was a prison built beneath their feet, ensuring no one could leave. Not in life, not in death. Cross couldn't sleep that night. Her dreams were filled with sounds of shovels, humming, the faint rhythm of footsteps underground. When she woke, her watch had stopped at 3:07 a.m. She noted it absently, then froze when she saw the dirt beneath her fingernails. She had not left the hotel room. The following day, she called in a geophysicist to verify the readings. He confirmed them reluctantly, but added one detail she hadn't noticed. The radar showed trace anomalies above the Diamala ring, tiny disturbances that appeared to move. Probably groundwater, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. When she asked him to define move, he replied, "They shift position between scans, almost like breathing." Later that evening, rain began to fall over Hollow Creek. The swamp stirred, water pooling in shallow depressions that hadn't been there before. Locals said the rain made the earth sigh, that it released trapped air pockets. But for those who listened closely, the sighs had rhythm. They rose and fell in time, like a low hum buried beneath the thunder. Dr. Cross stayed one more night, against the team's advice. She wanted to record sound data at the site. At 2:15 a.m., the recorder captured a faint vibration lasting 20 seconds. When enhanced, it revealed overlapping frequencies, too regular to be geological. When played through noise analysis software, the waveform showed distinct harmonic peaks. A voice pattern, she replayed it again and again until the words began to form, muffled but unmistakable. Not English, not French. A language traced to the Kisi people of Guinea. The translation, once verified, chilled her to the bone. "We remain because he bound us to his sin." The next morning, her equipment was found packed neatly beside the tent, the digital recorder missing. The site logs noted she left without signing out, her rental car still in the lot. 2 weeks later, the department received a sealed envelope, addressed in her handwriting. Inside were 3 printed images from the radar scan and a short note. "The circle holds. Do not open it again." The state ordered the area reburied under concrete and designated it a non-development zone. The ESAM official report cited unstable ground and historic contamination. But in the nearby town of Bayou Croix, people still tell their own version of the story, that the land itself rejected intrusion, that the dead there were not resting but waiting. Farmers say their crops grow twisted near the edge of the old property, roots bent in spirals as if following something deep below. On humid nights, they claim you can hear humming carried through the fog. Low, steady, endless. And every few years when the river floods, the water that runs through Hollow Creek turns the color of iron. Scientists call it sediment. The locals call it memory. They say it's the blood of those who worked and never left, rising again through the cracks. In old photographs of the site, before it was sealed, the ground appears slightly uneven. A faint circular mound, almost imperceptible, marks the place where the Diamala rests. Beneath it, 30 feet down, lie the remains of a ritual meant to silence generations, a place where the enslaved were turned into sentinels of their own suffering, where the boundary between flesh and spirit was blurred, not by faith, but by cruelty disguised as order. No one visits now. The air tastes metallic there, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Some who pass the road at night say they see figures, standing at the tree line, silent women in linen dresses, watching. They never move, never step forward, as if they are waiting for permission to finally walk away from the earth that would not let them go. But the soil still breathes, and until that breath stops, Hollow Creek remains exactly what it was, a place where obedience was eternal because escape was never truly possible.